Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affection towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow Him in all the ways that He's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and today I want to give a book recommendation, which we do from time to time here on the LBF Church Podcast. And it's related to the topic. We're going to be talking later on about virtue signaling. And if you don't know what virtue signaling is, I'll give a definition of it. But in preparation for this, I don't have the paper copy of this book because I buy a lot of books on Kindle now. But I want to recommend Flannery O'Connor's short stories. And the reason for that is that I think, other than Jesus, the greatest antidote towards virtue signaling is Flannery O'Connor, who is a Southern writer and was just ingenious. I have to give a disclaimer just to say, if you're not a frequent reader, the stories may be a little bit difficult. They are not super straightforward. They are uncomfortable short stories. And one of the reasons why they're uncomfortable is because most of them deal with people who are self-righteous, coming to the conclusion that they are actually awful people. These stories are uncomfortable. The main characters are often not admirable, but there's a deep trend that runs through these stories, a gospel trend that runs through these, of people coming face to face with their need for grace and the fact that grace is something that's offensive. So especially if you're a reader, even if you're not, I'm not telling you not to read it, but you can probably find a collection of her short stories. I found a complete collection on Kindle, but they are really, really worth reading. They will challenge you. They will make you think. All right, that said, let's get into the topic for today. We're going to be talking about the danger of virtue signaling. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when I say virtue signaling, I'll give a quick definition. Virtue signaling is doing or saying something in order to make sure that other people know that you are on the right side of the issue, that you are on the noble side of a question, that you are on the virtuous side of a controversy. So lots of different examples of how this goes on, but I'll just give a quick one. That's probably my favorite one because it made me laugh with how obvious it was. And it was, I think it was 2 years ago on Super Bowl Sunday. They're all the Super Bowl commercials, and Audi did a Super Bowl commercial. And it was one of those great commercials where it didn't actually really say anything about the car. What the commercial was 30 seconds or a minute of a man talking about how concerned he was for his daughter and wanted to make sure that she could have a career that would be just as good for her as if she were a man. And he's talking in his head about different things. How can I tell her about the wage gap? How can I tell her? How can I break it to her that she might be excluded? And I'm not even going to get into right now if any of the fears that were said in this man's head were founded or not. I know the whole wage gap between men and women is this issue that people have very strong opinions on. Just set that aside for a moment. Just say, this was a 30-second to 45-second commercial of Audi basically signaling to the country, hey, we care about making sure that women get paid as much as men. We care about making sure that women can advance in their careers just as much as men. We care about equality between the sexes when it comes to careers. And so, buy our car. There was nothing they were actually doing about the issue. It didn't end with some pledge to say, and therefore Audi will hire this many women, or Audi will make sure that we pay people equally. There was nothing like that at all. It was simply a 30-second spot of them signaling their virtue to the world to try to get people to then conclude Audi is a virtuous company because they care about the wage gap. Therefore, I should buy an Audi. Virtue signaling is when you are saying or doing something that's signaling to people that you are on the right side of the issue. And part of the danger of it is that it often costs you nothing. You're not signaling to other people that you're virtuous because you're actually doing something about the problem. You're simply saying in some way, I'm on the right side about this. I care about this. Social media is just rife with this. In fact, maybe half to 2/3 of what goes on social media sites is virtue signaling of some sort. People trying to say, no, just so you know, I'm on the right side of this. This happens, I remember this happening a few years ago when there was the terror bombing in Paris, and a bunch of people changed their profile picture to the French flag. To sort of say, all right, we care about Paris. Now, there's obviously nothing wrong with doing that. People do that from time to time when I don't know if it was when the Supreme Court case was going down about the Defense of Marriage Act, that a bunch of people did that with the rainbow flag. if you want to do that, fine, go ahead and do it. The thing that just strikes me about any time that somebody does that is I just want to say to them, now you do realize you didn't actually do anything. All you did was change your profile picture. That may be literally the least that you can do about that kind of issue. You just clicked a button. Now, if you want to do that, go ahead and do it. But don't fool yourself into thinking that you did something virtuous. You didn't do something virtuous, but you did something that will let everybody else know that you are on the correct side of this question. Now, here's the deal. Some of you might be thinking, all right, I get it, and that's kind of annoying that people would do that. But is that really a big problem? I mean, is that something that we really need to sit down and have a big conversation about because it's a big issue? And I'm going to say yes, I do think that this is a big problem, and for a couple reasons. At its foundation, this whole concept of virtue signaling is us seeking to get moral credit where it is unearned. It's us looking, it's almost the exact opposite of what Jesus talks about through chapter 6 of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, hey, you know what? When you're giving, don't let anybody know that you're giving. And when you're praying, do it in secret so that other people aren't looking and impressed with your praying. And when you're fasting, don't let anybody know. Just kind of fast in secret. When Jesus talks about that, the whole idea there is, don't worry if other people think that you're virtuous for doing these things. Do these things to be rewarded by your Father in heaven. And virtue signaling goes right against that and says, here's the most important thing. The most important thing is that other people are impressed with your virtue. And I think the other part that's such a danger about this is that often the whole basis of virtue signaling is us being able to say, I want everybody to know I am not one of those people. I'm good. I care about the wage gap. I care about unborn babies. I care about racism. I care about victims of terrorism or victims of gun violence and school shootings. I care about those people. I'm not like one of those people who are on the wrong side of this question. That sets us against other people. And again, it's not only tricking other people by trying to get them to admire us for really doing nothing, it's also in some ways tricking ourselves. Which I've said this before, but of all the dangers of social media, which I know we're going to post this on Facebook, so we're not anti-social media, but one of the greatest dangers of social media is the idea that we trick ourselves into thinking that we've done something virtuous when we actually haven't done anything at all. We've simply linked to an article or taken a strong stand that's just going to get us a bunch of likes and clicks and didn't actually cost us anything. Now, as we talk about all this, I want to be able to talk about this because Jesus gave a parable that I think speaks directly to this issue, that shows that this is not just a 21st century problem. This is not just something that's come about with the advent of social media or with mass media. This is something that's part of the human heart. This is a problem that at its core has to do with our desire to justify ourselves, our desire to say, this is why I am a good person. And it's one of his most famous parables. It's in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And I'll read through it right now. In verse 9, we get an intro to the parable. It says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. So before he even gets into the content, Luke gives us a signal to say, here's the purpose. It is a very real danger to be confident of your own righteousness. This is what gets into the exact purpose of virtue signaling. I want everybody else to know that I am a good person because I care about immigrants, because I care about unborn babies, because I'm not a racist like those other people. It's at the core of the idea of us building up our confidence in our own righteousness. And according to Luke, Jesus has a parable for you, if that's what you're doing. Jesus says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And some of you who are listening to this may be aware of the significance and the contrast of these 2 men. That the Pharisee was somebody who was a religious leader, somebody who was seen as an upstanding, moral citizen in Israel at this time. And the tax collector was about the lowest of the low. He was a traitor to the Jewish nation because he had looked at which way the wind was blowing. He'd looked and said, you know what, Rome is in charge and Rome is occupying Israel, and I could get rich by aligning with the Romans and then price gouging my fellow Israelites. The tax collectors were sellouts. The tax collectors had done something immoral. They were despised in Israel. So 2 men go to the temple to pray, one who's sort of the morally upstanding citizen, and one who has a sketchy, immoral, or at least amoral aspect to his life. And we get to hear what both of them prayed. So first it goes with the Pharisee. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. And by the way, the Greek is a little bit tricky on that. The NIV has it translated, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed. It might actually be better translated, the Pharisee stood and prayed at himself, or about himself, or to himself. Because what you're going to see is God is a peripheral member of this prayer. He is off to the side. Although the Pharisee does start by addressing God. He says, God, I thank you that I am not like other people. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. And you can see the whole purpose of the prayer. That's the whole prayer. You're waiting for the end to say, oh, about when is he going to address God once again? He addresses God basically to talk about himself. He addresses God to say, God, thank you that I'm good. Thank you that I'm a good person. Thank you that I'm on the right side of these issues. And he does it through 2 ways. He says, first of all, I'm good because I'm not like those other people. And secondly, I'm good because I do some good things. And the good things aren't necessarily things that actually benefit other people. They're deeply personal. All right, I tithe and I fast and I do some things like that. But I want to focus in especially in the idea that he pumps himself up by saying, I am not like those other immoral people. I'm not like the adulterers. I'm not like the tax collectors. I'm not like the robbers. I'm not like the swindlers. I'm not like the idolaters. That's how I know I'm good. That's how I know I'm a good person. That's how I know I'm a virtuous, righteous person, that I'm not like those other people. And the fact that the Pharisee is standing up and praying in a very self-promoting way also points towards the fact that he's kind of hoping other people overhear this prayer. And they listen in and they say, wow, that Pharisee, well, he does some good things. He doesn't commit adultery and he doesn't rob other people. And he's right. He hasn't sold out our race and our people like that tax collector is. So he's not overly greedy. They're able to notice his virtue. This is the ultimate parable against virtue signaling. And this is something that cuts to the heart because this is something that's very easy for us to do. And we might not do it exactly in our prayers, but that we might jump on social media, or we might be in a conversation with somebody, or if you have some kind of a public voice where you get to speak in front of other people, if you're a pastor like I am, you might have the opportunity to, in some sense, say, I am so glad I am not like those other people. I'm so glad I'm not like those atheists. I'm so glad I'm not like those racists. I'm so glad I'm not like those pro-choice people. I'm so glad I'm not like those people who turn a blind eye to terrorism. I'm so glad I'm not like those gun nuts. And the deal is, maybe even some of these things that we're naming as bad things, they truly are bad things. When the Pharisee talks about all the things that he's glad he's not, he's talking about things that he shouldn't be, things that would be immoral. And yet he's pumping himself up. He's raising himself up. He's holding on to the virtue of the fact that he is not like those other people. When you get to the parable of the tax collector, it's wildly different. It says in verse 13, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. So he's not around other people. He's not drawing attention to himself. But beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. This is a powerful contrast. First of all, the tax collector actually seems to be concerned with God in his parable. The Pharisee doesn't need God because he is so glad that he's already virtuous. The tax collector looks at himself and he doesn't conclude that he's virtuous. His only hope is to cry out to God for mercy because he's a sinner. In another instance of virtue signaling that it drove me crazy because it was from a guy that I really like. I don't follow almost anyone on Twitter. I'm not on Twitter very much, but this is a guy that I like enough because of his articles, and he's a great Christian guy that I follow on Twitter. And there was a story that happened, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, where there's this woman who's a well-known Christian author and Christian speaker who came out with the fact that a whole bunch of years ago, she had a really negative experience with some high-level pastors. And one of the experiences that she recounted was meeting with one high-level pastor, and he made some comment about her appearance that was sort of along the lines of, "Oh wow, you're a lot better looking than most of the other female women speakers that I'm around." And just a really bizarre, inappropriate instance. And I thought it was very good of her to come out with this, because she was exposing the fact that this kind of stuff does go on in churches. This is not okay. We need to be aware of these things. I thought it was a positive thing that she brought it to light, and she brought it to light in a way that was not self-aggrandizing at all, but was just giving information. And one of my favorite Twitter guys tweeted something along the lines of, "Well, I'm not a violent man, but wow, if I was in that situation and knew who that guy was, sort of ... And for me, this just drove me nuts. I was thinking, well, way to take this and make it all about you. Way to signal your virtue to the world, to say, well, I'm not a violent man, but I would have stood up for this woman's honor. Here's the deal. If you would have stood up for her honor, that's great. You don't need to signal to the rest of people that you would have done that when you actually haven't done anything to help solve the problem. For me, it made me say, God, I am so glad I am not like those virtue signalers. I'm just kidding, of course. That's just another way that this can play out. Maybe that's one of the dangers that I have people that drive me nuts on this, and I need to not pump myself up by saying, here's why I'm good, because I keep my good deeds to myself. The point was, this guy had taken a situation where he could have simply offered support, said something that would be helpful to this woman, or said something that would have been insightful to others, which he did in some other messages. But instead he took that moment to signal to everyone how virtuous he was and how he would stand up for the honor of women, without actually standing up for the honor of women. The tax collector, on the other hand, doesn't seem to be doing something that would cause anybody else to look at him. The Pharisee is standing and praying. The tax collector is crouching over himself and beating his breast and crying out to God for mercy. And the thought that crossed my mind is, this guy who said, if I was in this situation, I don't know what I would have done to this guy. I don't know how I would have handled it. Thought, maybe the better situation, maybe the better response that God is calling us to is to look at that and to say, there but by the grace of God go I. God, have mercy on me, a sinner, because who knows that I wouldn't do something as bad as what that other guy did. Who knows that I wouldn't have been as sexist or demeaning as that other pastor was. Why in the world would I think that I am more virtuous than that? At my core, I'm not. At my core, I'm somebody who needs God in order to give me any kind of righteousness. And at the end of the parable, what Jesus says brings to light what the parable is truly about. Because he says in verse 14, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. In other words, Jesus has just told a parable about self-justification, or about justification in general. That the idea is that the Pharisee has one strategy, and he says, here's the way I'm going to be justified. Here's the way that I'm going to be considered to be a good person, and I am worthy, and my life matters, and my life is good, and I'm important. Here's the way I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there by making sure that I see how I'm better than others, and also by making sure that others are aware of the ways that I'm more virtuous than others. And the other strategy was the tax collector to cry out to God, and in essence say, please justify me. The core of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that we are justified by God. The core is that we are not virtuous. We are not worthy, but the way that we have become worthy is that God has made us worthy through Jesus. That Jesus has succeeded, that Jesus is justified before God, and we're with him, and we wear his righteousness as a gift from him. And that cuts to the quick any time we begin to think that we are really something. Because I want to be practical with this, let me just give 3 takeaways, maybe 3 action points that we could respond to this, other than just saying virtue signaling is bad, don't do it. So number 1 does have to do with especially social media, but anytime you might be thinking, all right, I'm about to take a stand. I'm about to say something in front of other people that will show them where I stand on an issue. Pause anytime you're getting ready to do that and just ask yourself the question, will anybody actually be helped by me doing this? Is there going to be anybody that will learn something from what I'm doing? Is there going to be anybody that will actually gain some sort of benefit? Or am I doing this simply because I want other people to know that I care about those orphans, that I care about those immigrants, that I care about those unborn babies? If your only purpose is just to signal your virtue, I'm going to just give the advice, hold off on that. You don't need to. If you truly are virtuous because you truly do care about those other people, you have your reward from God. You don't need everybody else to know about that. So I'd say pause, and then if you conclude, nobody's really going to be helped by me changing my profile picture. Nobody's really going to be helped by me posturing about this issue. But people would be helped if I gave money to this cause. People would be helped if I went and volunteered for a big brother, big sister, and then started mentoring somebody. People would actually be helped if I made sure that I talked to my neighbors and tried to convince them of either this way of voting or this way of handling things, or if I did a gun drop where people that weren't supposed to have guns could drop them off. Just pause and think, all right, wait, let me just ask, if I really do care about this issue, what could I do that would actually be helpful instead of just signaling my virtue to other people? So that's number one. Number two is this: show a willingness to take an unpopular stance. Show a willingness to take a stance that's not going to get you a whole bunch of attaboy, attagirls. Be willing to say something that will impact people and that will show what side of the issue you're on, where you're on what other people would consider to be the wrong side of history. Jesus lives on, according to our world, the wrong side of history. Jesus lives as a man who was crucified in his own time and is largely set aside in our time. Be willing to take an unpopular stance. If you find, you know what, pretty much the stances that I take in public or around other people are the stances that make me look like a good person, ask the question, are you willing to take a stance that will make other people wonder about you, wonder how good a person, how compassionate a person you are? There's nothing brave about just figuring out which way the wind is blowing and then going in that direction. So that's number two, show a willingness to take an unpopular stance. And number three is to ask this: when you are concerned about what other people think about your own virtue, cling to Jesus and cling to the gospel. You will have times that there are people who think that you are a bad person. This has happened to Christians throughout time. This is something that happened to Jesus in his own time. If you are really walking the narrow path that Jesus calls you to walk, one of the sad things that's going to be involved in that is that people will not think you're virtuous. When you're in that situation and you find yourself desperately wanting to rage against that and either to discount those people because they must be bad people for thinking this way, or to compromise, to say, well, now I've got to take the other stance to show them that I'm still a good person despite my Christian beliefs. That moment, cling to Jesus and cling to the gospel. Cling to Jesus knowing that your ultimate reward doesn't lie here on this earth. Your ultimate reward lies in eternal life. Cling to Jesus in that, and also cling to the gospel. Use that moment when other people think that you're not terribly virtuous to be able to remind yourself, you know what, in the end, I'm not actually terribly virtuous. I'm not part of the family of God. I'm not adopted as a daughter or a son because I'm this great virtuous person that God just had to have in his family. I am an absolutely desperately guilty, lost sinner who is rescued by God. And so, you know what? They might think I'm not virtuous for the wrong reason. But if their conclusion is that I'm not somebody who deserves God's favor, they're actually right on that. And I can live with their disapproval because I can cling to Jesus as my reward, and I can cling to the gospel as my hope and as my justification. Hey, if you have questions about this or about other episodes that we've done on the LBF Church podcast, I welcome any interaction. I love it when people leave comments and when people leave questions or even disagreements with things that I've said on these episodes. If you want to do that, you can just go to our website, our church website, lbf.church. You can go to the little tab that says blog and podcast and click on that, and you'll find the video for this episode and lots of other episodes. And you can just go on there and leave a comment. And I love to go in. I'll interact with you about that. If you have a question, if you have a disagreement, if you have a question about how you would live out and apply this whole idea of trying to move away from virtue signaling, I'd love to interact about that. I also invite you to go ahead and subscribe to the audio of this podcast by just searching for the LBF Church podcast. We have past episodes from over a year now that God willing would be helpful to you as you're looking to follow Jesus and grow in your heart affection towards Him in the ways that He's leading you to go. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church podcast.